New York Harbor, 1943. A pale morning light breaks through the fog, spreading across the cold steel of warships waiting at dock. Steam rises from the ships' hulls, mingling with the breath of thousands gathered along the pier. Men in olive-drab uniforms shoulder their duffel bags, eyes fixed ahead but hearts somewhere else, on the women standing behind the rope line. Some wear red lipstick and brave smiles. Others clutch handkerchiefs already damp. A young soldier bends down to kiss his wife's forehead. Her hands rest protectively over a rounded belly beneath her coat. She whispers something. We can't hear it. But he nods, presses his forehead against hers, and forces a smile that trembles. The whistle screams. Orders echo. They separate. One by one, the men ascend the gangways. The ships moan as engines roar to life. Pregnant wives wave handkerchiefs until the shapes of their husbands dissolve into the gray horizon, swallowed by the Atlantic, by duty, by war. The harbor falls silent except for the gulls and the faint sobs of women left behind. And across America, this same scene repeats, thousands of times over. By 1943, America was a nation in motion. Factories roared 24 hours a day. The sound of hammers and engines had replaced the quiet hum of civilian life. Men, boys really, were trading baseball gloves for rifles, textbooks for field manuals. From California shipyards to small-town post offices in Iowa, draft notices arrived like thunderclaps. In just 2 years, the United States had built one of the largest military forces in history. More than 16 million men would serve before the war's end. Most were young, barely past high school. Many had married only months earlier in hurried ceremonies held before deployment. Courthouse weddings, church vows spoken under the dim glow of rationed electricity, and whispered promises of, "I'll come back." The attack on Pearl Harbor had turned an isolated nation into an arsenal of democracy. Across the Atlantic, Britain stood bloodied but unbroken. In the Pacific, the Japanese advance had finally been checked at Midway. Now all eyes turned toward Europe, where Hitler's armies controlled most of the continent. But behind the global maps and strategies were ordinary American homes. For every man who reported for duty, there was someone left behind. A wife, a mother, a fiancée. Many of those women were expecting. In 1942 alone, U.S. marriage rates surged to historic highs. The urgency of war compressed lifetimes. What might have been a 5-year courtship became a 5-day decision. Love, fear, and duty collided in living rooms and train stations across the country. A soldier might propose on Friday, wed on Sunday, and ship out by Wednesday. Letters became lifelines. Photographs were tucked into breast pockets like sacred talismans. And when the troopships finally departed from ports in New York, Norfolk, and Boston, they carried not just men, but the weight of millions of futures waiting to be born. America itself seemed to hold its breath. Newspapers printed casualty lists beside birth announcements. Radios carried Roosevelt's speeches over the static of tears and telegrams. The Homefront became a battlefield of patience and prayer. These men were not just fighting to liberate Europe, they were fighting to return home, to the wives who now carried a part of them under their hearts. Every ship that left the harbor carried 2 stories, one sailing into war, the other waiting for life. The journey from the American coast to the European front was perilous, long before a single shot was fired. By 1943, the North Atlantic had become one of the most dangerous highways on Earth. German U-boats hunted the sea lanes with ruthless precision. Convoys carrying troops, tanks, and supplies left from New York, Halifax, and Norfolk, moving in tight formations protected by destroyers and aircraft. The air inside those ships was thick with sweat, diesel, and fear. Young men packed into bunks stacked 5 high, their duffel bags and helmets pressed to their chests. The sound of engines thrummed beneath their feet like a beating heart. Many couldn't sleep, not because of seasickness, but because of the thoughts they carried. Wives back home, letters written but never sent, the life they'd left suspended between hope and memory. Some soldiers wrote messages to unborn children. They might never meet. I hope you have your mother's smile, one wrote in pencil on a scrap of ration paper. And that one day she tells you your father wasn't afraid. These letters would travel thousands of miles, sometimes reaching their destination after the sender had fallen in combat. Meanwhile, back home America was transforming. The war had drawn millions of women into factories and shipyards, replacing the men who'd gone overseas. Maternity wards in 1943 were full of young mothers in factory uniforms, women who welded aircraft parts by day and rocked infants by night. They became symbols of endurance, holding the nation together while their husbands fought across oceans. The U.S. government encouraged correspondence. V-mail, short for Victory Mail, allowed soldiers to write home using microfilmed letters that could be transported more efficiently. Every week, tens of millions of words crossed the Atlantic, words of longing, courage, and faith. As the troop convoys grew larger, so did the uncertainty. By late 1943, Allied leaders were planning the invasion of Western Europe. Rumors spread through the ranks. Something big is coming. No one knew when or where, but they knew it would be dangerous. In every letter home, there was the same quiet refrain. Take care of our baby. Those unborn children would never remember their father's voices, but they would inherit their silence, their sacrifice, and the peace those men were sailing to secure. From the ports of New York to the beaches of Normandy, these parallel worlds, the home front and the front line, were about to collide. The next chapter of this story unfolds not in America, but on the cold, gray waters of the Atlantic. The human angle war reduces nations to numbers, ships, guns, and divisions. But beneath those statistics lived millions of individual stories. Of men who were barely more than boys, and women who faced the hardest kind of waiting. For many soldiers, the final night before departure was spent in a small rented room, a train station hotel, or even the back seat of a borrowed car. They held their wives close, whispering the things they couldn't write down later. In that moment, the war seemed far away, but morning always came. When they boarded the ships, the separation was total. Weeks at sea without communication. Only the hope that both would survive the waiting. For the women left behind, pregnancy was both a blessing and a reminder. Each kick, each heartbeat was proof of life, a piece of their husbands that war could not take away. Some women would give birth alone, clutching faded photographs beside their hospital beds. Others would name their children after fathers still fighting overseas. The human cost of that distance was immeasurable. Letters often arrived months late, or not at all. When they did, they were read and reread until the paper tore at the folds. "Darling," one soldier wrote from the English countryside in 1944, "I feel our baby move when I close my eyes. Maybe that's God's way of letting me come home for a second." Behind the battle plans, the war was made of these fragile connections. Love written in pencil, sealed with hope, and carried across an ocean. The home front angled on the other side of the Atlantic. America became a nation of waiting women and working hands. The slogan, "We can do it," wasn't just propaganda. It was survival. Women who had never stepped into a factory now riveted airplane wings, assembled tanks, and built ships for the very men they loved. In 1943, more than 6 million American women entered the industrial workforce. The rhythm of factory sirens replaced lullabies. Pregnancy did not excuse them from effort. Many worked until the final weeks, refusing to rest while their husbands risked everything abroad. Hospitals near major cities overflowed with war, babies, children born during blackouts, their fathers thousands of miles away. Churches and communities stepped in to fill the emptiness. Neighbors shared rationed milk, babysat, and helped new mothers get through the lonely nights. War bonds were purchased in honor of unborn children. Prayers whispered for safe returns. Newspapers carried columns titled "Letters from the Front" beside wedding announcements and obituaries, reminders that love and loss were happening side by side. For many, the war years would be remembered less for victory or defeat, and more for the silence, the empty seats at dinner tables, the radio static between news bulletins, the sound of a newborn crying in the middle of the night. This was the hidden front, where courage meant enduring the waiting. Every mother-to-be, every factory worker, every lonely wife became part of a quiet army that never wore uniforms but bore the same burden. Their strength kept the nation from breaking. The tactical angle. Every farewell on the dockside was followed by a voyage through danger. The Atlantic was the world's largest battlefield, invisible, shifting, and deadly. By 1943, German U-boats had sunk over 2,600 Allied vessels. For every ship that left New York or Norfolk, survival was never guaranteed. The U.S. Navy organized vast convoys to guard against these attacks. Each convoy consisted of dozens of troopships and cargo vessels, escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft carriers. Men who had kissed their wives goodbye now slept in. Steel bunks, rocked by waves and the constant tension of the hunt. Inside the dark hulls of ships like the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, and countless Liberty ships, soldiers played cards, sang quietly, or prayed. The ships were so crowded that men took turns sleeping. Every time the engines faltered, they froze, unsure whether it was a mechanical pause or a torpedo strike. When sonar pings echoed through the night, hearts pounded harder than any storm could make them. In those endless hours, the thought of home became both comfort and torment. They had no idea whether they'd ever see that home again. For commanders, logistics were as vital as courage. The U.S. was transporting an entire nation's strength across an ocean: weapons, ammunition, fuel, food, and men, and doing it faster than history had ever seen. Each successful arrival in Britain meant the possibility of liberation inching closer. But on every deck, one thought remained. Would I live long enough to hold my child? The moral and philosophical angle. There was a strange contradiction in those years, one that still lingers in the collective memory. As men prepared to take lives, they were also creating new ones. Life and death, birth and destruction, all existed in the same breath. To conceive a child while preparing for war was not recklessness. It was defiance. It was a statement that love would continue even when the world was burning. Some soldiers wrote that the thought of their unborn children gave them courage. "I fight," one wrote from Sicily, "so that my son will never have to." These words captured an entire generation's purpose. They weren't just fighting against tyranny. They were fighting for the right to come home, to raise the families they'd only begun. Back home, the women felt the same paradox. Each time they felt the baby move, they were reminded of both hope and absence. In that small miracle of life, they saw what the war was really about: preserving the possibility of tomorrow. In military reports and strategy briefings, such emotions were never mentioned. But they were there, in every letter, every photograph, every folded flag that later came home in silence. When the ships neared Europe, many soldiers stood on deck staring into the gray waves, thinking about hospital rooms they might never see, names they'd chosen but might never speak aloud. It was this quiet moral weight, the awareness that they were leaving behind life to confront death, that gave the war its deepest human meaning. The next phase of their journey would test that meaning more than ever, because soon, the convoys would reach Britain, and from there, the men who said goodbye would face their greatest trial on the beaches of Normandy. Southern England, spring 1944. The quiet farmlands of Devon and Dorset had transformed into armed camps. American trucks rumbled through narrow lanes, fields filled with tents, and the skies throbbed with the constant sound of engines. Every soldier knew something enormous was coming. They just didn't know when. The men who had said goodbye months earlier were now part of the greatest invasion force in human history. Codenamed Operation Overlord, it was the Allied plan to storm Fortress Europe, to begin the liberation of a continent strangled by Nazi rule. Training was relentless. Amphibious drills at Slapton Sands, endless marching, weapons checks, and silent briefings. Every letter home was now censored. The words, "Can't tell you where we're going," appeared on nearly every page. But the tone was clear. The war's turning point was near. Some men carried small folded photographs in their breast pockets. Others wore wedding bands on chains around their necks, hidden beneath uniforms. Those photos would be the last image many saw before charging into gunfire. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the order finally came. Convoys of landing craft churned across the English Channel under gray skies. The sea was rough, the air thick with diesel and fear. Chaplains moved between men, offering quiet blessings. Few spoke. Most just stared into the dark horizon, waiting for dawn, and for whatever waited beyond it. When the first shapes of the French coastline appeared, it didn't look like the promise of victory. It looked like hell. Machine guns flashed from bunkers. Mortar rounds burst in plumes of sand and fire. Waves turned red. On Omaha Beach, where many American divisions landed, entire units were torn apart before they could even reach dry sand. Communications collapsed. Equipment sank. Commanders were killed within minutes. The beach became a graveyard of twisted steel, bodies, and shattered resolve. But through the chaos, they kept moving. Not for glory, not even for orders, but for something more personal. For the letters they carried, for the promises they made, for the unborn faces waiting on the other side of the ocean. Hours turned into eternity. By dusk, they had secured a fragile foothold, blood-soaked but unbroken. The cost was unimaginable. Thousands dead, tens of thousands wounded. Yet the invasion had succeeded. The road to liberation had begun. Back in America, telegrams started arriving. Some were marked "missing in action," others, "killed in action." For every victory headline, there was a door knocked on, a mother who fell to her knees, a wife clutching her swollen belly as her world collapsed. In Europe, the survivors buried their dead and prepared to push inland. Their faces were older now, not from time, but from what they had seen. The storming of Normandy was not just a military triumph. It was the moment when every goodbye from every harbor became real, when love and war collided in full. In the weeks that followed D-Day, Europe became a landscape of ruin and endurance. Hedgerows turned into battlefields. Towns like Carentan, Saint-Lô, and Caen were reduced to rubble. The American advance was steady, but every mile cost blood. The men who had crossed the Atlantic now lived day to day, fighting through exhaustion, mud, and the constant smell of smoke and death. In foxholes and shattered barns, they clung to the fragments of their old lives. The letters folded in, their pockets, the memory of a hand they once held on a quiet American street. Mail was still being delivered, even here. Army postal units worked around the clock to deliver millions of letters each week, often under fire. A soldier might open a wrinkled envelope weeks late to find a photograph of a newborn, a son or daughter he had never met. Some wept openly, their faces smeared with dirt and disbelief. Others said nothing, just stared at the image in silence, tracing the features of a child who would grow up not knowing their father's voice. One private from the 29th Infantry Division wrote home from Normandy. "I got your letter today. You said our baby has my eyes. I can't explain it, but that makes me feel alive in a way this place can't kill." Those moments of connection, brief, fragile, became lifelines. They reminded the men what they were fighting for. By the late summer of 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy had turned into a surge across France. The liberation of Paris came in August, and the mood shifted. Joy mixed with sorrow. Thousands of soldiers never saw that victory. Their names filled long white crosses across the fields of Normandy. Back in the United States, the first wave of war babies was being born. Newspapers called them "children of the storm." Hospitals overflowed with mothers clutching telegrams and baby blankets in the same hand. Some babies were named after fathers lost in Europe, others after the battles they'd fought: Norman, Arden, or Victor. As the front moved eastward, through Belgium and into Germany, the emotional distance between home and battlefield grew heavier. Soldiers began to realize that even victory could not repair what had been broken: time, innocence, and countless families separated by the cost of freedom. The letters never stopped. Even in December 1944, during the freezing chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, men still wrote in pencil by candlelight, their words trembling with cold. "Tell our baby I love her. Tell her I'm coming home." Some did, many didn't. But across two continents, in the blood-soaked fields of Europe and the quiet nurseries of America, one truth endured: that love had survived the war's cruelty, even when its people did not. And as the snow fell over Bastogne, and the Atlantic winds carried home another wave of letters, the world began to sense that the end was near, but not everyone would live to see it. May 1945. The guns finally fell silent. Across Europe, church bells rang for the first time in years. The war in Europe was over. Soldiers who had survived the long push from Normandy through the Ardennes and into Germany now faced a different battle: the journey home. For many, the return was not triumph but disbelief. They had left as young men full of ideals. They returned older, quieter, carrying both medals and memories they would never speak of. The voyage back across the Atlantic, once filled with tension and fear, was now heavy with reflection. Some ships were silent. Others echoed with cautious laughter, men wondering what waited beyond the dockyards. In New York, Boston, and San Francisco, the homecomings began. The same peers that had once seen tearful goodbyes now witnessed reunions that seemed almost unreal. Bands played, flags waved, and the smell of salt and steel mixed with perfume and tears. Among the waiting crowds were women holding children, some toddlers now, others still infants. Many of these children were meeting their fathers for the first time. The moment was often wordless. A soldier would step off the gangway, scan the crowd, and stop, frozen, at the sight of a woman holding a child with familiar eyes. A hesitant smile, a step forward, then, finally, embrace. Those few seconds carried the weight of years. Letters that had traveled oceans were replaced by trembling hands and the sound of a baby's laughter. But not every reunion happened. For thousands of women, the war ended in silence. Their husbands were gone, missing, buried in France, or listed as killed in action. For them, the telegram was the only thing that returned. Many widows wore black for months, sometimes years, before life forced them forward. Their children, born during the darkest days of the war, became living memorials, reminders of courage, of love cut short, and of promises unfulfilled. The government provided benefits and pensions, but no money could replace the sound of a familiar voice at the door. Communities rallied, churches held ceremonies, and entire towns honored the men who never came home. And as the survivors walked American streets again, they saw a country transformed, new factories, new suburbs rising, and a generation of women who had kept the nation alive. Their children, the so-called war babies, were now symbols of renewal, growing up in the light their fathers had helped restore. For those fathers who returned, holding their children for the first time was both joy and ache. Joy for what was gained, ache for what had been lost. They had fought to protect a world that no longer looked the same. The years following victory brought both peace and reckoning. The soldiers who had come home carried invisible scars, some hidden behind smiles, others buried deep beneath silence. They were hailed as heroes, yet few spoke of what they had endured. Nightmares, sudden tempers, or long periods of quiet became common in American homes. The term shell shock would later evolve into battle fatigue, but in those days It was simply the war that never left them. For many, fatherhood became the bridge between the horror of Europe and the hope of peace. Men who had seen death learned to cherish the small things: a baby's first steps, the warmth of a kitchen light, the sound of laughter echoing down suburban streets. The children born while their fathers were away would grow up during the greatest economic and social expansion in American history: the post-war boom. By 1946, birth rates had surged to levels never recorded before. Historians would later call it the baby boom, but for those who lived it, it was simply life returning. It was healing, the world proving it could rebuild itself after nearly destroying everything. In towns from Kansas to Connecticut, new neighborhoods sprang up seemingly overnight. The men who had once shared foxholes now built homes side by side, mowing lawns and fixing roofs instead of cleaning rifles. Their wives, who had spent the war welding aircraft and running households alone, adjusted to peacetime, though they never forgot the strength it had taken to endure those years. Yet even amid the joy, the shadows of loss remained. Every Memorial Day, women carried their children to cemeteries where white crosses stretched in endless rows. Some spoke softly to the wind, telling their lost husbands about first words, first steps, and birthdays missed. The U.S. government established programs to bring war dead home from Europe, but many families chose to leave them where they had fallen, in Normandy, Luxembourg, or the Ardennes, among the men they had fought beside. For the widows, their children became their continuation. "He never met his father," one woman told a reporter in 1947. "But he has his eyes. That's enough for me." These were not just personal stories. They became part of the nation's identity. The idea of the American soldier as both warrior and family man, protector and provider, was born in those years. It shaped the culture, the politics, even the optimism of post-war America. Love had not stopped the war, but it had survived it. The children born from those wartime goodbyes would grow up to become the engineers, artists, and dreamers of the next generation. The living proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, life insisted on continuing. And as the veterans grew older, their memories faded into history. But one image never did. That moment at the harbor, when they turned to wave goodbye one last time, knowing they were leaving behind not just wives, but the future itself. In the end, the story of the men who left pregnant wives behind is not simply a story of war. It's a story of faith in tomorrow. They boarded ships into an uncertain sea, not knowing if they'd ever see land again. Yet, in the months before they sailed, they planted something greater than fear: the hope of new life. That quiet defiance against death is what makes their story timeless. War is often remembered in battles and victories, but its truest measure lies in what people risked to preserve love. In every letter written from a muddy foxhole, in every photograph kissed before sleep, there was an unspoken belief that humanity, somehow, would outlive its own destruction. Those unborn children, born into a world still scarred by war, carried their father's courage in their blood. They would grow up hearing stories that faded like old film reels, piecing together faces from photographs and medals kept in drawers. Yet their very existence was the answer to the chaos their fathers faced. For the women who waited, endured, and raised those children, the war was not a distant headline. It was lived in silence. Their strength, too, became part of the victory. Today, when we look back at the black and white images of that era, ships departing under gray skies, women waving handkerchiefs, the endless expanse of the Atlantic, we see more than history. We see the purest contrast humanity can offer. Destruction on one hand, creation on the other. Every child born from those farewells was proof that life continues, even when the world breaks apart. The men who left did not know if they would return, but through those they loved, through the lives they created, they did. And somewhere, in every generation that followed, There remains a trace of that morning in 1943, when young American soldiers turned from the women they loved, stepped onto ships bound for war, and carried with them the quiet promise that love would endure. Even across oceans, even through death, even beyond time itself,